Who decides what a neighborhood is? For over a century, this place had been called a suburb, then a slum, a ghetto, then a village, and every time those labels changed its future. This is the story of Parkdale. To understand Parkdale, we have to go back to the late 19th century. At the time, Toronto was expanding westward. Just beyond the edge of the city sat a separate lakeside village, quiet, tree-lined, and marketed as refined. On paper, it looked like the perfect Victorian suburb. Developers described it as a place of very aristocratic pretensions, with attractive homes, clean streets, and a healthy breeze off the lake. But when you look past the promotional language and into the records, the picture changes. While the majority of newspaper articles and books published in the 1880s were exemplars of boosterism, praising Parkdale's social, economic, and moral status as the Flowery Suburb, the 1881 tax assessment rolls indicate that the most common occupation of the 216 household heads in the new village was railwayman. In all, a little over 1/3 of household heads could be classified as skilled laborers. Another third were self-employed small businessmen, including agents for manufacturers, owners of dry goods stores, and saloon and boarding house keepers. That demographic profile reflects geography. Parkdale sat beside 5 railway lines and near the industrial lands of the former Garrison Reserve, as well as 3 major institutions: the Central Prison, a women's reformatory, and the Ontario Lunatic Asylum. As the neighborhood grew, so did tensions about what it should become. Local political groups emerged, one advocating planning controls and slower growth, the other supporting more rapid development and profit opportunities, mainly through affordable housing and industry. After a period of recession in the 1890s, the demand for cheaper housing increased. When construction in Parkdale accelerated again in the earlier 20th century, the preferred housing form began to shift. In North Parkdale, modest semi-detached houses replaced the earlier pattern of large detached villas. These homes were less expensive to build and more attainable for the growing middle class. They allowed developers to use land more efficiently while still appealing to skilled workers, clerks, and small business owners. In South Parkdale, large undeveloped parcels of land became sites for apartment construction. This was not accidental. During Toronto's first apartment boom, developers were eager to locate new buildings in neighborhoods that still carried status, and Parkdale fit that profile. By 1915, it contained 10 large apartment buildings, roughly 1/3 of the city's total, concentrated along Queen and King Streets. These apartments were well built. They featured modern plumbing, solid materials, and often preserved the facades of existing villas. Tax rolls from the 1910s show they housed mostly white-collar tenants. At the same time, many of the large villas constructed in the 1890s were being divided into 2 or 3 flats. Their size made conversion practical. As a result, Parkdale developed a reputation as a place where affordable rooms could be found. But public reaction did not focus on the supply and demand dynamics. Newspapers and public officials warned that apartment houses threatened morals as well as health. A 1912 public health report on slum housing targeted lodging houses and tenements, and City Council acted to ban apartments from most residential streets. Although Parkdale was not officially labeled a slum at this point, the language of slum reform, the fear of density, of renters, of social imbalance was already circulating across its streets. The 1930s depression and World War II exacerbated a growing trend to divide Parkdale's houses into multiple units. The Lieutenant Governor's report of 1934 on housing conditions already targeted this concern. According to the report, Parkdale's housing problem is the result of the economic deterioration of what was formerly a prosperous district of quite large, substantial houses. Into these houses are now crowded a vastly greater number of families than the architects ever foresaw, and it was said to be fast becoming a serious slum. And the numbers make it clearer. By 1941, 62% of houses constructed as single-family dwellings had multiple household occupancy, almost twice Toronto's average rate of 34%. As a function of the increase in tenants, Parkdale's home ownership plummeted from 51% in 1931 to 14% in 1941, considerably below the Toronto average of 33%. For the next decades, local officials, newspapers, and pressure groups returned again and again to the same language, warning of overcrowding, of moral decline, of apartments and rooming houses as breeders of slums. That long accumulation of slum rhetoric would soon matter, because after 1950, cities across North America began to act on exactly that kind of language, reshaping neighborhoods in the name of renewal, and Toronto was no exception. Between the late 1940s and 1960s, Toronto became a prime site for modernist urban planning experimentation. With the National Housing Act of 1944 encouraging new housing construction and slum clearance, the city underwent extensive physical and social restructuring, most visibly in places like Regent Park and the former ward. In Parkdale, urban renewal first arrived in the form of infrastructure. The construction of Toronto's first expressway, the Gardiner, cut through the southern edge of the neighborhood, destroying 180 houses and displacing more than 700 residents. At the same time, post-war Toronto was growing quickly. Immigration and the baby boom increased the city's population through the 1950s and 60s, and demand for affordable rental housing surged. One response was verticalization. With federal financial support, developers constructed high-rise apartment buildings across central Toronto. In Parkdale, dozens of older houses were demolished to make way for these towers. Differently from places like Regent Park, this was not a single master-planned social experiment. These buildings were not designed to engineer moral reform. They were part of a broader push to modernize aging housing stock and increase supply. Yet, they emerged from the same planning era that treated old urban fabric as obsolete and high-rise living as progress. By the 1960s, Parkdale contained a dense mix of subdivided Victorian homes, rooming houses, small apartment buildings, and newer rental towers. This layered housing stock made it one of the few central neighborhoods capable of absorbing large numbers of tenants. Then, another policy shift reshaped the area. Beginning in the late 1960s, Ontario reduced long-term psychiatric institutionalization. Many former patients were discharged into community housing, and Parkdale, with its concentration of small, relatively inexpensive rental units, became one of the primary destinations. By the mid-1970s, the overconcentration framing was pushed harder and harder. But the concern was not simply about living conditions, it was about composition. Who lived there, in what kind of housing, and in what numbers? City officials began describing South Parkdale as an area with a disproportionate number of group homes and small rental units. A 1974 planning report recommended limiting the further spread of these facilities in the name of deconcentration. The debate soon focused on one specific form of housing, the bachelorette apartments. These were small, self-contained units often created through the conversion of larger houses or former rooming houses, many of them illegal. For landlords and speculators, they were a way to meet strong demand for inexpensive, private units. For tenants, they were among the few affordable options left in the central city. But for many residents' groups, they symbolized disorder. A residents' coalition, the Parkdale Working Group on Bachelorettes, argued that the proliferation of these units destabilized the neighborhood and undermined family housing. When the group's chair was elected to city council in 1978, a bylaw was quickly passed banning new and converted boarding or lodging houses in Parkdale. The 1970s planning approach was not demolition, as seen in other urban renewal projects. It was regulation, cap conversions, restrict small units, limit group homes. By the end of the decade, Parkdale had become a highly concentrated rental district, with formal planning controls aimed at containing further change. And those efforts didn't stop with the 1970s. By 1983, the city had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars closing roughly 60 bachelorette buildings in Parkdale, displacing approximately 300 residents. The effort was framed as restoring stability. Planning documents celebrated the progress and reiterated the goal of transforming South Parkdale back into a stable urban village. And this policy was encouraged by the media, who continuously framed the neighborhood as a service ghetto, a place defined by poverty and disorder. By the 1990s, concern about the loss of affordable rental housing started surfacing in planning reports. But at the same time, new zoning measures restricted further rooming houses and bachelorette development, and limiting new affordable units in a rising rental market made that goal of restoring a healthier mix of households harder to achieve. By the early 2000s, Parkdale stood at a crossroads. For decades, policy had tried to contain density, regulate small units, and restore balance. But now, a different force began reshaping the neighborhood: money. As Toronto's downtown grew wealthier and more desirable, neighborhoods once dismissed as unstable became attractive investment opportunities. Parkdale, close to the city's core, rich in Victorian architecture, and still relatively affordable, drew renewed attention. And this attention came with a growing price tag. The high-rise rental towers built in the 1950s and 60s became valuable assets. Over time, many were purchased by large corporate landlords and real estate investment firms. The deeply affordable housing forms that had defined Parkdale for generations, like rooming houses and small apartment units, were disappearing. Community-based research in the 2010s documented what many residents already knew. Parkdale remained one of Toronto's most rental-heavy neighborhoods, but the supply of truly low-cost housing was shrinking. Tenants in several towers in the neighborhood organized rent strikes after facing steep, above-guideline increases. Their argument was simple: the new landlords were using renovation and maintenance upgrades as a pathway to raise rents beyond what many residents could afford. The driven inflation revealed a growing contrast within the neighborhood. While properties north of Queen Street continue to rise in value, thousands of residents remain in aging apartment towers south of Queen, many facing repair backlogs, rising rents, or uncertain tenure. The divide was no longer simply about overcrowding, it was about displacement risk. The same policy language also evolved: revitalization, balance, healthy mix. These phrases returned in planning documents, echoing debates from decades earlier. But this time, they unfolded in a city where housing costs were climbing rapidly across all income levels. Today, more than 90% of South Parkdale housing remains rental. Thousands still live in aging towers built 70 years ago. At the same time, detached houses north of Queen now sell for prices unimaginable a generation ago. Cafes, galleries, and boutiques line stretches of West Queen Street West. The image of Parkdale as an urban village circulates again, this time in real estate listings as much as planning reports. The neighborhood contains both realities at once: investment and insecurity, restoration and repair backlogs, rebranding and rent strikes. Parkdale has been called a suburb, a slum, a ghetto, a village. Each label has carried consequences. Each has justified a different kind of intervention, from regulation to clearance to revitalization. Every era produced a group powerful enough to define what Parkdale was, and to act on that definition. And the people who lived there often had to adapt to those decisions. So when we ask who decides what a neighborhood is, the answer isn't abstract. It's whoever has the power to turn an idea into policy, or into profit. And in Parkdale, that struggle is still unfolding. If you like this type of content and would like to learn more about the environment that surrounds us, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Stay tuned for more!